I found out my wife was sleeping with my cousin in front of our entire family. It happened at the annual reunion, in my parents' backyard, under the same oak tree where we used to play football as kids. She stood there, holding a glass of wine, her hand resting on his shoulder like it had every right to be there. Then she smiled and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm leaving you for him." I didn't shout. I didn't throw the drink in her face. I just looked at her, nodded once, and said something that turned her world upside down. But let me start 10 hours earlier. My name's David Lawson, 39 years old, construction project manager out of Fort Worth, Texas. Married 12 years to Emily. Until that afternoon, I thought we were the couple people envied. We had a house, 2 kids, a golden retriever, the usual picture-perfect setup. And my cousin Ryan, he was family. Grew up together. He was the kind of guy who never held a job longer than 6 months, but always managed to show up smiling at barbecues, beer in hand, telling stories that made him sound like a hero. Emily used to roll her eyes when he visited. Said he was trouble. That's why it hit different when I saw her laughing with him lately, the kind of laugh she hadn't used with me in a long time. I started noticing small things. Her phone turned upside down on the counter, texts she'd delete faster than I could blink, gym bags that didn't smell like sweat. But I didn't confront her. That's not who I am. My dad taught me that real strength isn't in yelling. It's in waiting, watching, and moving when it counts. So I started preparing. Quietly. I made copies of the house deed, our bank records, her messages when she left her laptop open one night. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew I'd need proof. That morning at the reunion, everyone was there, my parents, siblings, cousins, uncles. The smell of grilled ribs, country music, kids running through sprinklers. Emily was glowing. Too much. I remember thinking she looked like someone who had already made a decision. And then, in front of 40 people, she made it official. Said she was leaving me for Ryan. Said they were in love. Said it like she was proud. Everyone froze. My mother dropped her drink. My father went pale. Ryan stood there, smirking, like he'd just won something. I didn't move. Didn't say a word for a long moment. Then I looked her in the eyes and said, "You should have checked whose name's on the deed before you packed your bags." The color drained from her face. Because she didn't know that while she'd been planning her new life, I'd been building something she could never touch. And that was just the beginning. When I said those words, she blinked like she hadn't understood. My cousin shifted uncomfortably, the grin faltering. The air changed. My father looked at me. Just one of those old, knowing looks. He understood what had just happened, even if no one else did. I didn't wait for a reaction. I just turned and walked back toward the house, through the laughter that had died mid-sentence. Every pair of eyes followed me. The thing about moments like that, you don't need to raise your voice. Silence speaks louder than any outburst ever could. Back inside, I went straight to my study, the one room Emily rarely entered. There was a folder in my desk, thick, labeled Foundations. It held copies of every major asset we owned, the house, the truck, the savings account, the joint investments. But the title on every one of them had the same thing in common, my name. Only mine. See, 2 years ago, Emily had convinced me to refinance the house. She said it was to pay off student loans, lower the monthly payments. I agreed, but when the paperwork came through, I read every line. And there, buried in the fine print, was a clause that would have given her half ownership. I quietly rewrote the filing and used my separate account to finalize it through my own attorney. She never noticed. She just signed what I handed her. That's the thing about trust, it blinds people. So while she thought she was walking away with me as collateral damage, I knew the truth. She was walking away from everything. I heard her voice outside, trembling now, trying to keep control. My cousin muttered something about how I was being dramatic. I smiled quietly to myself. That was the word people used when they didn't realize they'd just lost. By the time I stepped back outside, the crowd had thinned. My mother was consoling the kids inside. Emily stood there, trying to act composed, but her eyes darted everywhere but at me. Ryan avoided my gaze completely. I didn't say another word. I just handed her a small envelope. Inside was a printed bank statement, her secret account, the one she'd been funneling money into from our joint one, bit by bit. What she didn't know was that I'd already reversed every transfer, months ago, using authorization she'd signed without reading. Her face fell. I didn't need to say anything. She finally realized the truth. Every move she'd made, I'd seen coming long before she acted. And for the first time in our marriage, she was the one left speechless. That night, after the reunion ended, the house was silent. The kids were staying with my parents, and Emily had packed a small bag, thinking she'd be leaving with Ryan. She didn't. He'd disappeared the moment the truth hit the air. Typical. He was always brave until there were consequences. She sat on the couch, staring at the bank statement in her hand. I could see the disbelief in her eyes, the way people look when they realize the world isn't what they thought it was. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. The silence was doing all the talking. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, almost unfamiliar. She asked how long I'd known. I told her it didn't matter, that everything she'd tried to hide had already been accounted for. She asked if I hated her. I told her I didn't waste emotions on things that were already over. Then I went upstairs and locked the door. While she slept on the couch, I sat at my desk reviewing what came next. I wasn't going to destroy her publicly. I wasn't interested in humiliation. But I wasn't going to let her walk away clean, either. I made a list: divorce attorney, title verification, insurance updates. Everything that would transfer control fully to me before she even realized the paperwork was moving. The next morning, Emily was gone. She'd taken her car, a few clothes, and the wedding photo from the mantel. The empty space where it used to be looked strange, lighter somehow. I made coffee, opened my laptop, and started sending emails. By noon, I had spoken to my attorney, confirmed the separation terms, and filed the initial petition. At 3 p.m., Ryan called. His voice was nervous, like he was the one who'd been betrayed. He said Emily had told him I was threatening her. I didn't respond. I just listened. He kept talking, trying to sound confident. But underneath, I could hear the cracks. When he finally asked what I was planning, I told him he'd find out soon enough. After the call, I opened a folder on my computer labeled Cousin. Inside were screenshots, text logs, and photos, all gathered quietly over months. I'd never planned to use them, but now they had purpose. Not for revenge, for leverage. Because this wasn't just about a broken marriage anymore. It was about control and who truly held it when the masks came off. The next few days felt like a strange kind of calm. The kind that comes after a storm, when the air still smells of electricity. Emily didn't come home. She texted once, asking when she could pick up her things. I didn't reply. She'd find out soon enough that she didn't have much left to pick up. Ryan tried calling again. I ignored him. He left a voicemail saying we needed to keep this between family. That was his way of trying to bury the truth before it reached anyone who mattered. But what he didn't understand was that family wasn't a shield anymore. It was the battlefield. I spent those days quietly setting traps. The kind that don't look like traps until they've already closed. I met with my attorney, a calm, gray-haired woman named Laura who didn't ask many questions. She'd seen worse. I gave her the files, everything I'd gathered. Bank records, text logs, photos, even the transfer receipts where Emily had used our joint funds to book hotel rooms for work trips. Laura read through them, her expression never changing. When she finally spoke, her tone was measured. She said this wasn't just grounds for divorce, it was financial misconduct. Adultery tied to joint assets meant Emily's leverage would evaporate in court. I asked her what would happen if I wanted full custody of the kids. She said, with evidence like this, it was likely. I told her to proceed. That night, I drove past my cousin's apartment complex. His truck was in the lot, lights off, blinds closed. I didn't stop. Didn't need to. The real damage was already done. The quiet kind. The kind you don't see until it's too late. 3 days later, Emily's mother showed up at my door. She looked angry, confused, like she'd been dragged into a movie halfway through. She said Emily was scared, that I was being cruel, that I needed to let her go peacefully. I just listened. Then I handed her a sealed envelope. Inside were copies of the text messages between Emily and Ryan. No commentary, just facts. By the time she finished reading, her voice was gone. She didn't say another word, just turned, walked back to her car, and left. That was the first moment I realized how silence could break people faster than shouting ever could. A week later, the gossip had spread through town like a brush fire. Small towns have long memories and fast mouths. The story had twisted a dozen times by then. Some said Emily ran off with Ryan to start over. Others whispered that I'd thrown them both out. I didn't correct anyone. The truth didn't need my help anymore. It was working quietly, piece by piece, through every circle they used to move in. I kept my focus on the plan. The house was legally mine, and the bank confirmed it. The savings account had been frozen under pending legal review. The joint credit cards were canceled. Every trail that connected us was being erased, not out of spite, but precision. At night, I reviewed the custody documents Laura had drafted. She advised patience. Emily hadn't filed her response yet, which meant she was hesitating, probably waiting for Ryan to step up. But Ryan wasn't built for that kind of responsibility. He was the kind of man who vanished when things stopped being fun. I'd seen it since we were kids. I was counting on it now. 3 nights later, I got an email from Emily. Short, almost polite. She said she wanted to meet to talk about what comes next. The tone was calm, but I could read the desperation underneath. I agreed to meet, but not alone. We met at a diner on the edge of town. Laura sat in the next booth, quietly taking notes. Emily arrived looking thinner, her confidence gone. She said Ryan had been distant, that he was talking about moving to another state. She asked if we could handle this privately. I told her everything was already in motion, that it was too late to negotiate outside of court. Then I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a breakdown of every transaction she'd made from our joint account. Hotel bookings, restaurant charges, gas stations, all linked to Ryan's card. She stared at it in silence, the color draining from her face. I told her I hadn't shared it with anyone yet, but if she tried to fight custody, I would. She didn't argue. She just nodded slowly, the same way I had the day she humiliated me. Only now, she understood what that silence really meant. When she left, I didn't watch her go. I just looked down at my coffee and thought how strange justice can sound when it finally speaks. Quiet, steady, and absolute. 2 weeks passed before I heard from her again. By then, the paperwork was almost complete. Laura had everything lined up for the final court date, and the custody recommendation was leaning heavily in my favor. I didn't celebrate. There's no victory in this kind of war, just endurance. One night, as I was closing up my laptop, I got a call from an unknown number. It was Ryan. His voice was slurred, nervous. He said things weren't working out between him and Emily. He said she'd been distant, angry, unstable. I listened, not saying a word. He kept talking, trying to sound like he wasn't panicking. Then he admitted something that made everything fall into place. Emily had told him I was broke, that she'd left me with nothing, that she'd be getting half the house and all the savings once the divorce went through. He was starting to realize that wasn't true, that she'd lied to him just like she'd lied to me. And now he was scared. I didn't say a word. When he asked what I wanted from him, I told him the truth. Nothing. Because by the time he figured out what he'd already lost it all. The next morning, I got an email from Laura. She said Emily's lawyer had reached out with a proposal. She wanted to settle, no trial, no dispute. She'd sign over her share of everything, withdraw her custody claim, and agree to a clean split. I knew what that meant. Ryan was gone. The dream she'd traded our family for had collapsed faster than it started. When I met Laura to sign the final documents, she said something that stuck with me. She told me most people in my position would have tried to ruin their ex completely. But I hadn't. I'd just taken back what was mine. That kind of restraint, she said, was power most people didn't understand. I told her power wasn't the goal, clarity was. That night, I sat on the porch with a beer, watching the sun dip behind the trees. For the first time in months, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Somewhere out there, Emily was realizing that every step she'd taken away from me had been a step off solid ground. And I hadn't pushed her. I'd just stopped catching her when she fell. The court hearing was brief, almost anticlimactic. Emily sat 2 rows ahead of me, hair pulled back, eyes hollow. She didn't look at me once. When the judge asked if she understood the terms of the settlement, her voice cracked as she said yes. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe differently. When it was over, Laura handed me the final decree. My name was the only one listed on the property, the accounts, the custody order. Clean. Precise. Final. Emily stood up slowly, like she was learning to walk again. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she wasn't listening. I knew that look. It was the face of someone who finally realized that actions have gravity. Outside the courthouse, she waited by my truck. I considered walking the other way, but curiosity stopped me. She said she wanted to apologize. Not to fix anything, just to say it out loud. She said she'd made mistakes, that Ryan wasn't who she thought he was, that everything had spun out of control. I listened. Then she asked if there was any part of me that still cared. I told her I cared about stability, about our kids, about peace. And that's exactly what I'd built. What I didn't say was that her apology came too late. Some things don't break. They dissolve quietly until there's nothing left to repair. She nodded, tears in her eyes, and said she hoped one day I could forgive her. I told her forgiveness wasn't something I gave out loud. It either existed or it didn't. Then I got in my truck and drove away. That night, after the kids were asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked around the house. It was quiet, too quiet, but it was mine again. Every inch of it. Every nail, every memory. And in that silence, something shifted. Not relief. Not even victory. Just stillness. The next morning, Ryan called again. I let it ring. He left a message saying he was leaving town, that he needed to get his life together. I deleted it without listening to the rest. Because the truth was, I wasn't angry anymore. I'd already done what most people never do. I'd turned betrayal into structure, chaos into order, and I'd done it without raising my voice once. A month passed after the divorce was finalized. The kids were adjusting better than I'd expected. Routine helped. School, homework, dinner at 6, lights out by 9. I made sure their world stayed steady, even if mine had shifted completely. Emily called once a week to talk to them. I never interrupted, never added comments. Just listened from the kitchen while they spoke. Her voice always cracked at the end. Ryan was gone. Word around town was he'd left for Arizona, chasing another business opportunity. Nobody cared enough to ask what that meant. In a small town, people eventually move on to the next scandal. Theirs had burned too bright and too fast. All that was left now was ash. One Friday night, I drove out to my parents' place for dinner. My father pulled me aside afterward. He said he was proud of how I handled everything. Said he'd never seen someone stay that composed through a fire like that. I told him it wasn't about strength. It was about control. He nodded slowly and said control was strength if you knew how to hold it. Driving home, I thought about that. About how people mistake silence for weakness when really it's a weapon. The loud ones burn out fast. The quiet ones rebuild. The next morning, I got a letter in the mail. No return address. Inside was a photograph, Emily and Ryan, taken months before everything fell apart. It was from one of those cheap photo booths at the fair. They were smiling, carefree, before they understood what real consequences felt like. On the back, she'd written 5 words. I hope you're at peace. I folded it once and placed it in a drawer. Not out of nostalgia, but documentation. Proof that peace had nothing to do with apologies. That weekend, I took the kids fishing for the first time since everything happened. They laughed, shouted, fought over worms. It was the kind of noise I missed, the right kind. I realized I didn't need revenge anymore. I'd already won by surviving it cleanly. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I looked out the window at the backyard where everything had started. The same oak tree, the same shadows. And for the first time, the memory didn't sting. It just existed, like a scar that no longer hurt when touched. It was early autumn when Emily showed up again. I heard her car before I saw it, the same white sedan she'd driven the day she left. She parked in front of the house, but didn't get out right away. The kids were at school. The air was cold, still. I opened the door before she could knock. She looked smaller somehow. Not thinner, but diminished. Her eyes flicked past me, searching for signs of warmth that weren't there. She said she only wanted to talk. I told her I'd give her 10 minutes. She said she'd found a job in another city, part-time, trying to get back on her feet. Said she wasn't asking for money, only a chance to see the kids more often. Her voice trembled when she said she'd made mistakes. I listened, not out of pity, but because I'd already learned that silence unsettles people more than confrontation. When she was done, I told her the schedule would stay as it was. I said stability mattered more than emotion now. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Then she said something that caught me off guard. She'd seen Ryan again, briefly. He'd been arrested for fraud in Arizona. She said she wasn't surprised. She just wanted me to know. As she turned to leave, she stopped at the door and said she didn't hate me for what I'd done. That if anything, she respected it. I told her respect wasn't the goal. It never had been. After she drove off, I stood there for a long time, watching the dust settle on the road. The quiet felt heavier than usual, but not in a bad way. More like the kind that comes after a story finally ends. That evening, my daughter asked if her mom was okay. I told her she was trying to be. Kids see more than you think, and lies don't protect them, they only confuse them. She nodded and went back to coloring. Later that night, I found myself standing by the same oak tree where everything had started. The leaves were falling, covering the ground in gold. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about loss or betrayal. I was thinking about rebuilding. Quietly, deliberately, on my own terms. Winter came early that year. The mornings were sharp, the kind that made the air taste metallic. Life had settled into something steady. Work, kids, evenings that ended in quiet. Sometimes I'd catch myself listening for chaos, realizing only then how much I'd grown used to it. Now the silence meant safety. One night, I got an email from an unknown address. It was Emily. She wrote that she'd moved out of state, found a small apartment near her new job. She said she was trying to start over. Said she'd finally realized that peace didn't come from someone else fixing your life. It came from owning what you'd broken. At the end, she thanked me, not for forgiving her, but for teaching her what real consequences looked like. I read it twice, then archived it without replying. Some conversations don't need answers. That same week, I started building something new behind the house, a small workshop under the oak tree. The kids helped paint the walls. It wasn't much, but it felt like progress. Every nail, every plank, was a piece of life reclaimed. One evening, my father stopped by. He stood in the doorway of the workshop, watching me work. He said he'd been thinking about what I'd been through. Said most men fall apart when they're betrayed that way. I told him maybe I did fall apart, just quietly, piece by piece, until I built something better in its place. He smiled at that, the kind of small, proud smile fathers give when words aren't enough. Later that night, after everyone was asleep, I sat outside with a cup of coffee, looking at the finished workshop. It wasn't perfect, but neither was I. The scars, the lessons, the silence, they'd all become part of the foundation. I thought about that day at the reunion, the laughter, the shock, the words that had changed everything. I'm leaving you for him. I could still hear her voice. But louder than that, I could hear my own reply. Calm, precise, the one that turned her world upside down. Now, years later, I understood something I didn't then. Strength isn't loud. Revenge isn't fury. Sometimes, the greatest power a man can hold is the ability to walk through fire, come out clean, and never raise his voice once. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.